Hello, and welcome to the NEBOSH Diploma, Element B4, Hazardous Substances, Preventive and Protective Measures. To summarise this presentation, we will look at an introduction to KOSH, the KOSH Regulations 2002 as amended, exposure controls and good practice, a case study on hand soldering, KOSH essentials, barriers to good control practice, and other useful sources of information. Using chemicals or other hazardous substances at work can put people's health at risk, so the law requires employers to control exposure to hazardous substances to prevent ill health. They have to protect both employees and others who may be exposed by complying with the Control of Substances Hazardous to Health Regulations 2002, or KOSH. KOSH is a useful tool of good management, which sets 8 basic measures that employers, and sometimes employees, must take. KOSH provides a simple step-by-step approach which will help employers to assess risks, implement any measures needed to control exposure, and establish good working practices. KOSH Basics. First, we need to assess the risk, control the risk, and maintain the controls. These are simple principles to prevent ill health. KOSH requirements. To comply with KOSH, employers need to follow these 8 steps. Step 1. Assess the risks. Step 2. Decide what precautions are needed. Step 3. Prevent or adequately control exposure. Step 4. Ensure that control measures are used or maintained. Step 5. Monitor the exposure. Step 6. Carry out appropriate health surveillance. Step 7. Prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents and emergencies. And Step 8. Ensure employees are properly informed, trained and supervised. Who should conduct the risk assessment? It is the employer's legal responsibility to conduct the risk assessment, but others can do some or even most of the work of preparing it on their employee's behalf. Others assisting in the assessment should have access to and understand the KOSH regulations and relevant approved codes of practice, or find someone else who does. Should be able to get all the necessary information and have the knowledge and experience to make correct decisions about the risks and the actions needed. The employer and the employees have the most knowledge of what really happens in the workplace. They should use this knowledge before deciding whether outside help is required. If there is no expertise available in the company to assess the more complex risks, they will need to get help. For example, a professionally qualified occupational hygienist or health and safety specialist. The employees or their safety representatives or safety committee should be involved in assessments as they have valuable contributions to make. They must also be informed of the results of the assessment. Step 1. Assess the risks. The employee's first step is to decide whether there is a problem with the substance or substances the company is using, or those to which their employees are incidentally exposed. This is called a risk assessment. Employers must identify the hazardous substances present in the workplace and consider the risk these substances present to people's health. Consider the risk these substances present to people's health. Assessing the risk involves making a judgment on how likely it is that a hazardous substance will affect someone's health. Employees need to ask how much of the substance is in use or produced by the work activity and how could people be exposed to it. For supplied substances, the HSE has developed a generic risk assessment guide called KOSH Essentials to help. Who could be exposed to the substance and how often? Employers must remember to include all groups of people who come into contact with the substance, i.e. contractors, visitors and members of the public as well as employees, and don't forget those involved in maintenance and cleaning tasks. Also, certain groups of people could suffer more from exposure than others, e.g. pregnant women and individuals with a suppressed immune system. Is there a possibility of the substances being absorbed through the skin or swallowed, e.g. as a result of a substance getting into the mouth from contaminated hands during eating or smoking? And are there risks to your employees at other locations if they work away from the main workplace, e.g. lone workers. Step 2. Decide what precautions are needed. If the employer identifies significant risks, she or he must decide on the action needed to take to remove or reduce them to acceptable levels. Also, the assessment needs to be recorded and reviewed. If the employer has 5 or more employees, they must make and keep a record of the main findings of the assessment, either in writing or on a computer. The record should be made as soon as practicable after the assessment and contain enough information to explain the decisions they have taken about whether risks are significant and the need for any control measures. Step 3. Prevent or adequately control exposure. The COSH regulations require the employer to prevent exposure to substances hazardous to health if it is reasonably practicable to do so. Control of substances hazardous to health. COSH requires that employees prevent exposure, if reasonably practicable, using the hierarchy of controls to eliminate, substitute, contain, use other engineering controls, procedural controls and also PPE as a last resort. Step 3. If prevention is not reasonably practicable, the employer must adequately control exposure. What is adequate control? COSH 2002 states that adequate control is in applying the 8 principles of good practice set out in Schedule 2A to COSH. For carcinogens, mutagens and asthmagens, exposure should be as low as reasonably practicable, and the statutory duty to apply principles of good control practice, compliance with workplace exposure limits, to regularly inspect and maintain controls, and referring to the approved code of practice in EH 40. If the substance causes cancer, heritable genetic damage or asthma, reducing exposure to as low as reasonably practicable and not exceeding the workplace exposure limit for the substance if there is one. COSH Essentials. Easy steps to control chemicals. The COSH Essentials Easy Steps to Control Chemicals Guide and free website gives advice on adequate control measures for supplied chemicals and a number of common industrial operations. COSH Essentials Easy Steps to Control Chemicals is aimed at small medium enterprises and involves simple risk assessment. It shows that a controlled approach is needed and there are control guidance sheets available. It is an internet tool and it's free. Dermal CE is a screening tool which should be applied with common sense. The nuts and bolts of COSH Essentials. Step 1, we define the hazard groups. Step 2, we estimate the degree of exposure. Step 3, we identify the control approach. And Step 4, we refer to task-specific control guidance sheets. Here we have an example of a control guidance sheet. This is for engineering controls. What is meant by good control practice? Good control practice is a consensus view of the hardware, systems of work, and other measures that need to be put in place to control the risk. We find these in ACOP's Approved Code of Practices and HSE guidance, industry standards, such as trade associations and lead players, professional bodies, e.g. BOHSs and technical guides, journals, reference books and published papers. Good practice is a definition taken from the HSE's policy and guidance to inspectors on reducing risks as low as reasonably practicable in design. It's generally accepted that the concept of good practice is not consistently understood by industry. Companies with similar processes may disagree on how far to go to reduce risk to acceptable levels. There is plenty of written guidance available if people know where to look, and it's easier for larger companies with in-house specialists. COSH 2002 Principles of Good Control Practice. The COSH 2002 regs introduced Principles of Good Practice for the first time as mandatory. It's nothing new, just a rejig of long-established hierarchy of control. there is a stronger emphasis on control at source, reliance on good design and physical measures rather than procedural controls and PPE as the main ways to reduce exposure. A broader whole task view of controlling exposures, all routes of exposure, and interaction with overall health and safety. Principles of good control practice. Design and operate to control emissions at source. Control all relevant routes of exposure. Controls should be proportionate to the health risk. The hierarchy of effective and reliable controls should be applied. Suitable personal protective equipment only when adequate control cannot be achieved by other means. To check and review continuing effectiveness of controls. Inform and train employees and ensure that no unintended increase in overall health and safety risks occurs. Step 4. Ensure that control measures are used and maintained. Employees should make proper use of control measures and report defects. COSH requires the employees to make proper use of control measures and to report defects. It is the employer's responsibility to take all reasonable steps to ensure that the employees do so. Employees should receive suitable training, information and appropriate supervision. Every element of the control measure should continue to perform as originally intended. COSH places specific duties on the employer to ensure that exposure controls are maintained. The objective being to ensure that every element of the control measure continues to perform as originally intended. This applies to items of equipment such as local exhaust ventilation and to systems of work which will have to be regularly checked to make sure that they are still effective. Respiratory protective equipment should also be examined and, where appropriate, tested at suitable intervals. COSH sets specific intervals between examinations for local exhaust ventilation, and the employer must retain records of examinations and tests carried out for at least 5 years. Step 5. Monitor exposure when there could be a serious risk to health if control measures fail or deteriorate, exposure limits might be exceeded, or control measures might not be working properly. Under COSH, the employer has to measure the concentration of hazardous substances in the air breathed in by workers, where the assessment concludes that there could be serious risks to health if control measures failed or deteriorated, exposure limits might be exceeded, or control measures might not be working properly. However, employers do not need to do this if they can show by another method of evaluation that they are preventing or adequately controlling employees' exposure to hazardous substances. Step 6. Carry out appropriate health surveillance where an employee is exposed to one of the substances listed in Schedule 6 to COSH and is working in one of the related processes. Where employees are exposed to a substance linked to a particular disease or adverse health effect, and a reasonable likelihood under the conditions of the work of that disease or effect occurring, and it is possible to detect the disease or health effect. Step 7. Prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents and emergencies. This will apply where the work activity gives rise to a risk of an accident, incident or emergency involving exposure to a hazardous substance, which goes well beyond the risks associated with normal day-to-day work. In such circumstances, the employer must plan the response to an emergency involving hazardous substances before it happens. Step 8. Ensure that employees are properly informed, trained and supervised. COSH requires the employer to provide their employees with suitable and sufficient information, instruction and training, which should include the names of the substances they work with or could be exposed to and the risk created by such exposure, and access to any safety data sheets that apply to those substances, the main findings of the risk assessment, the precautions they should take to protect themselves and other employees, how to use personal protective equipment and clothing provided, results of any exposure monitoring and health surveillance, without giving individual employees' names, emergency procedures which need to be followed. The employer should update and adapt the information, instruction and training to take account of the significant changes in the type of work carried out or work methods used. Let us now look at a case study on hand soldering. The task was hand soldering of printed circuit boards and their subcomponents. Existing controls included dip extraction, local exhaust ventilation at soldering benches, a maintenance regime and staff training. The company is a small company employing less than 10 employees, which is set up in a modern industrial unit on an industrial estate. Cash flow is an issue, and investments in exposure controls are put off to release money to lease and buy adjacent unit for expansion. The MD is hands-on with production work and leads by example. A visit from the HSE prompted health surveillance and airborne dust fume monitoring, and established the need to improve. Careful evaluation of the local exhaust ventilation options suitable for their working environment discovered real difficulties to design effective systems for casting and for dressing products of a wide range of shapes and sizes. No COSH Essentials guidance sheets apply, and the industrial ventilation manual examples are not relevant to this particular layout and situation. So we ask the question, are the principles of good control practice in place? We need to consider a number of principles. Principle A, design and operate processes and activities to minimise emission, release and spread of substances hazardous to health. We need to list all work groups and unit operations: hand soldering, flow solder and surface mount machine operators, desoldering, repairs and trainees. Designed to minimise exposure, to automate the process using a low rosin flux, solders, mechanical jointing or crimping and soldering temperature. And we need to reduce the number and size, quantity of emission sources using production scheduling. Principle B, take into account all relevant routes of exposure. Inhalation, fume from individual hand soldering and background room air, and skin contact, the use of liquid fluxes and pastes. Which is most significant, inhalation or skin contact? Principle C, control exposure by means which are proportionate to the health risk. So what is the health risk? Occupational asthma, eye and respiratory tract irritation, dermatitis and skin sensitization. How far do we go? Are there any exposure standards? We need to consider the severity of harm, the likelihood of harm occurring, and uncertainty associated with the standard. Asthmagens demand precautionary approach so far as is reasonably practicable. Principle D, choose the most effective and reliable control options that minimise escape and spread of substances hazardous to health. For each unit operation and the overall situation, you should focus on the most significant sources first. Routine work on printed circuit boards, subcomponent assembly, desoldering and others, and the hierarchy of controls. Eliminate is not feasible. Automate, solder flux selection, customer requirements, staff experience and training, working technique and behaviour, tip extraction, other types of LEV and general ventilation. Who designs and chooses the best options? Principle E, where adequate control of exposure cannot be achieved by other means, to provide in combination with other control measures suitable personal protective equipment. PPE. PPE is the last resort. Look at protective clothing, overalls, gloves and individual issues. Respiratory protective equipment programs, the selection, use and maintenance. Is it the correct type? Is it technically adequate? Comfortable? Have you conducted fit tests? Trained users? The storage, filter changing and the clean and repair of RPE. And is the PPE compatible? Principle F, check and review regularly all elements of control measures for their continuing effectiveness, looking at work technique, posture and workload, tip extraction maintenance and daily checks, the management system to schedule checks on all elements of control measures. How do you know that control measures are effective? The need for qualitative and quantitative checks. Principle G, inform and train all employees on the hazards and risks from substances with which they work, and the use of control measures developed to minimise these risks. Looking at the training programme, do operators understand the health risks? Have the limitations of exposure controls been explained? Are you confident that the control measures in place are effective and easy to use and proven to work long term, and are operators equally confident? Principle H. Ensure that the introduction of measures to control exposure does not increase the overall risk to health and safety. Other health and safety risks include burns, the use of solvents, flammable and toxic, manual handling and ergonomic aspects, trips and falls, and electrical hazards. Are there any new risks? A good control solution is one which minimises the health risk while reducing maintenance burdens, being relatively foolproof and not introducing other risks. Why good practice is not universal. This slide shows barriers to implementation, including PPE being quick and cheap and offering false reassurance, and money there being no business case, or the company is strapped for cash, or there's no fear of enforcement. Or simply, we've never had an accident, so why bother? Most barriers are institutional and not hardware. Barriers of perception rather than resources. So the top 5, no history of health problems, lack of competent people, low profile of health issues in the company, lack of communication, and poor understanding of health risks. Other information sources include written guidance from COSH, Brief Guide to the Regulations, COSH 2002, the Approved Code of Practice and Guidance, EH40, Workplace Exposure Limits, and COSH Essentials, Easy Steps to Control Chemicals. All the above can be obtained from HC Books. Useful websites include the following: HC COSH webpage, eCOSH Essentials, HC Asthma webpage, SBS Business Link, the British Occupational Hygiene Society, and the Annals of Occupational Hygiene, and HC Books. Thank you for viewing this presentation.